You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
We talk a lot about war and warfare on this show, but we don't really talk about how militaries get to that point. How does a military get equipped, get trained, and ready to fight? Now, we talk about Clausewitz a lot and his influence on militaries and military strategy, but he's also influenced a thing called defence policy. And strategy and defence policy should go hand in hand. But what is defence policy? How is it formulated? And why is it an important part of the public debate on how a nation governs itself? I don't know any of the answers, which is a shame, but I have found someone who does. G'day listeners, it is Mick, your humblest host with a show named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. Thank you very much for your support over the holidays. It is great to see the iTunes reviews for the person that left us a 1-star review that says too many mouth noises on the show. Well, that's what talking is. Talking is a mouth noise. But if there are other mouth noises that are bothering you, I have found a way to fix it. Please just don't listen to the show. For everyone else, thank you very much for the support to our drive for members, the Patreon TDP community members. You can join the membership scheme at the Legends, Legends Plus, Legends Plus Plus, and Legends Plus 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 schemes, and from there you can get a range of different bonuses, access to exclusive content, admission to our forum. There's a members blog where you can publish your thoughts, and finally, I get some of your money to help the show continue. Now, let's get to the topic today. We're talking about defence policy, which is something I know a little bit about, and largely it's because my guest today was one of my lecturers this year. And I'm doing the interview after the grades have already come in. So that means that for all those who are on course with me this year, I'm not trying to grade grub. My guest today is, of course, Dr. Andrew Carr. He is a senior lecturer at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. His publications include work on Australian foreign and strategic policy, defence studies, middle power theory, and Asia-Pacific security. His latest book, Winning the Peace, Australia's Campaigns to Change the Asia-Pacific, published by Melbourne University Press in 2015, examines how Australia has tried to influence Asia's security and economic order. And I will tell you, it doesn't matter how many times you reference that work in one of your essays, if he's marking it, he will be an honest marker, which is a bit of a shame. He is also the co-editor of Asia-Pacific Security and Introduction, and that was published by Georgetown University Press in 2016, as well as Australian Foreign Policy, Controversies and Debates, Oxford University Press, 2014, and Andrew is also the editor of the Centre of Gravity policy paper series here at the ANU. Now, they are actually really good for students who are looking for very quick primers to shape your thoughts if you are studying strategic and defence studies. Now, we're here to talk about a different paper he's written, which is actually one on bipartisanship in defence policy debate and how it may not necessarily assist the formulation of robust defence policy. And that is called I'm Here for an Argument, and that is available on the Australia Institute website, which is tai.org.au. Andrew, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Mick. Thanks for having me. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Excellent. It's actually, he's not calling. I'm in his room with all his books at the moment. Now, the bookshelves are not mahogany. However, there are a lot of books in here, and if you feel like stealing books, I will leave his window open when I leave. Now, Andrew, before we actually get into the nitty-gritty about defence policy, bipartisanship, partisanship, the lack of robust debate or the influx of robust debate, we'll let our listeners hang on the hook there for which way we're going to go. I'm interested to find out more about yourself and what got you interested in studying, writing and teaching about strategic and defence policy.
So originally I trained to be a political journalist, and I wanted to do politics and write about it. And I wanted to try and avoid doing those kind of cadet roles of cat up tree stories and court reporting.
Yep.
So at uni, someone suggested if I did honours in politics, I could potentially kind of jump the grade. And this was soon after the Iraq War, so I ended up writing about that. And I just had so much fun kind of enjoying it that it just built and built and ended up a large kind of political thesis. And while I was studying and doing this extra work and starting to really look about being a political journalist, I realized journalism is actually a lot like hard work. You have to spend all day on the phone talking to people. And whereas if I was an academic, I could read the books that I was reading anyway, but get paid to do it. So I switched over to politics full time, and here I am.
And when we won't talk about hard work and whether or not academics work hard. There are basically because I want to make it out of the building alive. But at the next Canberra Drink and Think, maybe we can talk about it then when we've got a couple of journalists there who say they work very, very hard. Looking at you, David Rowe. When we talk about defence policy, what exactly do we mean?
So the TLDR version is the mitigation of strategic risk.
Okay.
If strategy is the use of force for a political aim, when we do defence policy, we're trying to manage the risk that other people might use force against us and work out how that, what kind of risk that we're willing to accept, what costs we're willing to pay to try and reduce that risk, and what the most effective and efficient ways to do so are. Defence policy, I always say, is a little bit like war. It has this tendency to the total. Mm-hmm. You can always spend more, you can always build more and do more in order to reduce that overall level of risk. But that then comes at a cost to other important things in society, like the strength of the economy, like healthcare. And so defence policy is this really fascinating intersection, for my mind, between broad political value judgments about the world, what's actually important to us and what kind of a world do we want to live in, what kind of a society are we, and technical and kind of complex organisational questions about how to best achieve those aims. And it's really the intersection of the two where defence policy's big questions lie, I think.
It all made sense to me, but of course I've just spent a little bit of time studying it. I find defence policy often is what grabs the headlines, but in Australia we tend to have a defence policy that grabs the headlines around industry capabilities. We've only just had the foreign policy white paper released this year, and we're starting to see a bit more of a turn towards the diplomatic elements of this. Although the Defence White Paper 2016 did have a fair bit of foreign policy ideas and soft power within it. Now, we're here to talk about your paper, which I think the title is excellent. I'm here for an argument. It pretty much should be my life motto.
Thank you.
For anyone who's ever worked with me, they probably think I'm a signatory to your paper, but I think it's a great title because what you're arguing is that bipartisanship on behalf of our political representatives may not necessarily be beneficial to policy formulation, particularly defence policy formulation. Well, the paper's about defence policy. What exactly do you mean about this?
So there's a standard model of how to do defence policy well. You get a bunch of experts, or ideally one master strategist. Think your George Kennan, your Henry Kissinger type person. And then you put them in a room and give them the resources they need in order to work out how best to mitigate that strategic risk. And then support them. And you get the whole society united behind them and hopefully support them for the long term. And that's the idealized model. And with not a lot changing in our strategic environment over the last 30 years, it's been easy to believe that the responsible thing is to kind of continue on along this nice motion. And I think the strategic community and your listeners probably feed into this idealized model as well. And it's intuitive, it's compelling, but I think it makes a couple of really problematic assumptions. The first is that it ignores the role of those larger political and value judgments that I just mentioned a moment ago. So it tries to assume that you can take the politics out of these questions, but the whole basis of the exercise is to protect a political community. And that community has to pay the costs and wear the risk. And so it's impossible to kind of make objective decisions about a lot of these issues. What's more, scholars have shown that even in authoritarian societies, tyrants who don't have to worry about elections, they still calculate how politics works and influences their strategic policy decisions. So it's a kind of model of politics stripped out of policy that just doesn't really make sense in the real world. At a more fundamental level, I think it also gets a few things wrong about how humans think. Most of us, our notions of reason are actually kind of biased. You think of anchoring biases, salience biases. There's dozens of problems in it.
Yeah.
And most of us are also kind of lazy when it comes to reasoning.
I know I am.
Certainly, that's why I'm an academic, right? But we're lazy when it comes to assessing our own judgments. Why do I believe X rather than Y? But we're actually very good when it comes to questioning others or to try and develop reasons in order to persuade others to our view. And so if you view reason and human memory, which is very short, we remember very little about the world. Scientists guess it's about about a half a gigabyte. Your phone has 100 times that.
Yeah, hopefully, because it needs to record this, but yeah.
So you look at humans and you think they're actually kind of flawed creatures.
Yeah.
But the genius of humanity, the reason we've been able to achieve so much, whether for good or for ill, is because of our social interactions. And these systems of memory and reason work far better as ways of social interactions. So to take a detour for a second, I think it's tempting to believe in individual strategic genius, but I think even the dead Prussian probably can't really be understood just by his intellect alone.
Yep.
So without Napoleon to provoke in action,
Yeah.
there wouldn't be the words and kind of mediation on what it all meant that led to On War.
Yeah.
If you didn't have the growing professionalization of the military and education systems around that time, Clausewitz wouldn't have been as rigorous a thinker and exposed to as wide a range of ideas.
Yeah.
And if he didn't have his wife to bounce ideas off, then he wouldn't have gone further and deeper than anyone else has before.
Yeah.
So I know I'm on risky ground here, potentially the first to diss the dead Prussian on your podcast.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's refreshing.
But I think we really need to realize the benefit of thinking with and through others. And without open public debate, that can't occur. Now, in peaceful times, the standard model has worked pretty well for us. But when I look at the Australian case, and I've looked around the world at Canada and Britain and other examples, the standard model increasingly is raising costs in terms of low levels of accountability, low levels of policy quality, and not delivering on its promise to protect those actually kind of carrying out policy on our behalf, the uniformed troops, that are just kind of costs that we can't afford anymore. And so it's not that I like partisanship and joining groups and that kind of group herd mentality, but I don't think there's any realistic alternative to actually having these open debates about strategic policy and how we actually defend the community itself.
It's interesting, this idea of the master strategist. I'm sure there's people out there that would consider themselves along those lines. I know I certainly am one. But the idea
you are, Mick. It's all right. Yeah.
The idea of it being a fallacy. It's also refreshing to have someone on here who's willing to criticise Clausewitz. So the show's named after him. It's not in awe of him. I personally find a lot of his writing very dense and hard to get into. And I think if you don't find his writing dense and hard to get into, then you're probably dense. Because if you read any book in between 1 and 8, then it's a tough slog. But this idea of bipartisanship, we've talked about the dangers of the model working in peace, but not necessarily living up to what it should be doing, and also the driving costs that are actually not affordable.
Yeah. What
is driving bipartisanship though? Is it take Australia for example? Is it because Australia's challenges are binary, black and white, or are those challenges more complex? And is there a more complex reason for bipartisanship on defence policy?
That's a great question. Look, when I criticise our politicians for too much bipartisanship, I think they actually try and do it from the best of motives. Yep. They believe that the standard model is right. They believe that this is such a technical, complex area of policy that they just want to give the experts, the people in uniform, the resources they need and let them kind of go away and solve the problem.
Yeah.
So I think that they're trying to do the right thing. As I explained, I don't think that's the best judgment. But for many years, it worked. Australia's strategic environment, really since the late 70s, has been extraordinarily peaceful. So we had very low levels of strategic risk, and we were able to mitigate them very cheaply. So it made sense, and our parties kind of coalesced around what those answers and responses were. That's the external factor, but I think there's a couple of internal factors driving this bipartisanship. It's notable that if you look just a bit before I talked about, in the 1960s and early 1970s, there was open, genuine debate about the right way forward. We, I think, overstate just how troubling those times were about, mummy and daddy were leaving. The United Kingdom and the United States were seemingly pulling out of our region. There was rising powers, shifting ideologies. We were worried about our place in the world. And our political parties had this vibrant, often bitter, public debate about the right way. And they ended up kind of convincing each other half of the way. They each gave up part of their views. So the Labor Party famously comes to embrace the US alliance. And the Conservatives come to recognise the value of multilateralism and regional engagement and going beyond kind of traditional alliance frameworks. So the parties kind of argued themselves to this consensus. Over time, because the conditions got better, we came to see that consensus as somewhat natural and inevitable and the only kind of logical way to view the world. And the problem is that as the world's changed, we've become ever more kind of firm and rigid in trying to hold on to that model. So we've had our politicians in Australia spend the last decade saying, oh, we don't have to choose. We don't have to spend much more. We don't have to do anything that's really unpopular to ensure our security. And yet they all know the world is starting to change around them. And I think they're starting to realise just how problematic those assumptions were.
And we talk about how problematic those assumptions can be. It sounds like there's a little bit of stagnation, but probably not outwardly until your paper labelled as, particularly as using the term stagnation. But with stagnation, with a lack of change, a lack of adaptability, there comes a danger. Just in any sort of endeavour. If you don't adapt, there's a risk there. What is the danger for defence policy if there is a lack of rigorous partisan debate on defence policy? Is it that, you can use Australia as a middle power, I suppose, where we are in the region? Is the danger that Australia doesn't keep up with its neighbours? Is the danger that we don't support our main allies? What is the danger of not having these robust debates?
That goes to the heart of the question. And, I think the danger is that you become increasingly rigid and inflexible around a certain set of policy settings. You all kind of end up a bit like trying to be Churchill in 1940. We just will hold on. And there's moments in times when that's right. But more importantly than just kind of being stuck to one model, you don't know how well that model works. If you think of other fields of human endeavour, in a market or in a classroom, you can do ways to test how well your choices are doing. Is the product selling well? Are the students getting better at their assignments and learning over time? But in defence policy, outside of the kind of crucible of war, there's no way to say, is this the right policy or not? Other than having some form of debate and discussion and willingness to test your ideas via engagement with the world, via levels of accountability for those proposing it, via public debate and kind of public reasoning about, well, does this fit the kind of community that we are in and the kind of circumstances that we face? And so democratic societies have this kind of underlying genius in that they are much more able to kind of adjust and shift over time. And new ideas and personalities can to permeate to the top and have that kind of over change that either better align with international conditions or with the public view of themselves and what they hold as priorities. And this was something Machiavelli actually recognised in the 16th century. He's famous for this kind of hard-nosed model of realpolitik. And yet he said open societies, republics of his time and things, are likely to be more adaptable and therefore more able to kind of adjust as the circumstances change. And that gives them a greater vitality to more rigid authoritarian systems. So we have this notion that authoritarian systems are strong when it comes to strategic policy and democracies are weak. But the whole history of the 20th century and even the last few decades of the century before show actually that democracies are far more resilient and vibrant and effective at conducting strategic policy. They adjust and shift over time, and that flexibility actually gives them an underlying strength that a much more rigid system, when challenged in a strategic contest, is often far less able to actually maintain. And so we have these kind of presumptions about the weakness and problems of our own system that I don't think the empirical reality actually justifies. And so it's tempting to believe in master strategists who can go out and work it out. It's tempting to believe in the need for just firmness and holding on in that way, that we can kind of just give over our policy choices to man or machine. But it speaks to an illusion of control, of unity, of organisation that just doesn't reflect the real world and doesn't really explain how democracies have done so well over the last few centuries.
And, democracy, I think, is a very key point. Particularly liberal democracies like Australia, the US, Canada, Britain, and I'll give a shout out to New Zealand because I haven't done it for a while on the show. But an important part of that, and for all my journalist friends, I'm not going to sit here and go on about my opinion on what's happening to the fourth estate. I think I've covered that pretty comprehensively previously with some of the journalists I've interviewed on the show. But the media was an important part of that. We don't see too many calls for debate about defence in the mainstream media, the elusive, ephemeral mainstream media that goes out there. But people aren't going to see it on their bespoke social media channels either. So how do people, and our listeners, because no one else will actually hear this information, how do they go out there? How do they find out more about defence policy issues? How do they get involved in the debates? How do they encourage their political representatives to debate these issues if these debates are not occurring already?
Well, I reckon your listeners are probably pretty well served.
Yeah.
Anyone kind of foolish enough to put this in their earbuds for a few hours a week is probably okay and above the norm. But if we return to this idea of defence policy as the kind of mitigation of strategic risk, it's easy to see a couple of clear areas for public communication and engagement with. Kind of shaping what kind of a society we are, having views about what kind of costs you're willing to pay, about the nature of our international environment. What are countries that we would support? What level of support would we pay to that? And I don't think you need very high levels of technical knowledge in order to make those judgments. They are often political and value judgments. And those need to feed into our political system. The experts and boffins who design the submarines or organise our army structures need to understand the environment and context within which they're making those choices. And I think that's something that the public can do straight away, as much or as little as they know already. But I also think we need to be humble about how little each of us does know about the world. It's tempting to believe we know everything about Donald Trump. We can all make jokes at his expense. But how much have we actually read of his speeches? How much serious have we thought about what kind of a worldview does he have? And if we are, for the next 3 or 7 years, going to be aligned with the United States, and I remain a firm supporter of the US alliance, what kind of costs will we pay in order to protect that alliance and to cooperate with a state like the United States as led by Donald Trump? So I think we need to kind of move a little bit away from some of the jokes and tendencies that we make and actually be humble about how little we know about what's going on. And most of the time, citizens can just leave it to others. But in times, particularly like today, great strategic risk emerging of uncertainty and change, I really believe there's a responsibility of the citizen in a democracy to pay attention, to watch the news, and to add their voice, however much they do or don't know, to that larger debate in order to help shape and drive it in ways that reflect their society, such that when a politician makes the call, we can or we can't commit to that conflict, they do so with some understanding of what the public will actually support and what the public actually values in engaging that support. And that, to my mind, is the real citizen's responsibility. Anyone with a smartphone in their pocket has already enough information in order to be able to understand and engage defence policy. And you don't need to know, the volume and mass of a submarine to work out whether we need them or not. But we do need to have some kind of level of humility about saying, well, maybe we don't know much about the world, but maybe there are key judgments that we can make that help inform larger policy choices about what kind of a society we are, what kind of risks we're willing to wear, what kind of costs we're willing to pay in order to ensure our own security and the security of others as well.
I love that you said adding voices to the debate, because that leads me to our final question. And we could sit here all day and talk about defence policy formulation, but I've just done a year of study on it, and frankly, I've had enough. No, that's not true, listeners. I love this stuff. As Andrew knows, he's a regular attendee at our Canberra Drink and Think.
Sick, sad puppy.
We have a question on the show. It's a question I ask everyone, and it's about adding voices to the debate on what I consider one of the most important areas that society must debate, and it's kind of what we've just been talking about, and it's about war and warfare. And we try and add to the work of Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, to add more flavour to this debate. Some guests have added the same flavour. It's like, there's the typical Clausewitzian response to this question, which tends to be the allspice people pour on it because it will solve all the problems. We'll see how you go. But each guest gets to finish the sentence, war is. So, Andrew, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
Ideas made violent.
Oh, excellent.
So we can see, count, and smell the material aspects of war.
Yeah.
And it's tempting to assume that material factors tell us almost all we need to know about war. That big defeats small, quick is better than slow, more is better than less. But the material aspects of war, for my mind, are the proxies and byproducts of the conflict at its heart. And I don't think there's anything automatic about the effects of material parts in the outcomes and nature of a conflict. Rather, I think it's ideas that drive and motivate war. It's an idea that applying pain will cause people to act and change in a political sense that might be valuable to you. It's an idea that leads men and women to give their lives in war. And it's ideas that cause, determine, and conclude conflicts. So developing and testing our ideas about war, I think, is actually the fundamental challenge in many ways. It's more important than adding another submarine or adding a further army division. And I think, here I might just be restating Clausewitz. And, it was hard to kind of come away from his fantastic view. But war for me is ideas with force attached. And I think unless we understand the ideas and give them their central place, we'll never really understand the effect or the significance of that force.
Wow, that's a new one. I'm sold. War is ideas made violent. It's also very tweetable, and Andrew, being a big Twitter follower, he will be able to tweet that. Not until the episode's out, though, please. Andrew, thank you very much for coming on the show.
My absolute pleasure.
Thank you for not failing me this year as well. That's also helped.
Touch and ball.
Now, ladies and gents, you can read Andrew's paper, I'm Here for an Argument, as I said, on the Australia Institute website, tai.org.au, or just go to Google and type in I'm Here for an Argument, and also type in Andrew Carr, because if you just leave the title in there, you get a lot of stuff. I also recommend his book, Winning the Peace. It's quite a handy book for those people that I know there are a lot of listeners out there that will be studying with SDSC next year. It is an excellent book to get your head into before you go into the Strategic and Defence Policy module. As I said, listeners, Andrew's also on Twitter, so follow him at AOCarr. That's AOCARR. And until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.